Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to this update on the forecast for the upcoming few days. Today is Friday, September 22nd, and we're really reaching the peak of that severe weather event that we talked about a few days ago. We had some severe weather up in far southwest Nebraska, northwest Kansas yesterday as expected, and today into the weekend we are expecting to see some more severe weather, perhaps peaking on Saturday, tomorrow, September 23rd, all the way from the northern plains into the Midwest down to the south to the southern plains. We're going to start off and take a look at what's going to happen today briefly, and then we're going to really dive into tomorrow as that looks to be the greatest threat. And then there is now a risk for Sunday, so we'll talk briefly about Sunday's threat at the end of the video. Today's threat is much more localized, at least the more intense severe weather is going to be more localized today than what was previously expected. So not going to spend too much time on today's threat. We do have a slight risk for today across eastern Wyoming, southwest South Dakota, northwest Nebraska. There is an all hazards threat. 5% tornado risk exists for that area with a damaging wind and large, perhaps significant hail threat there as well. There is a slight risk today across the eastern seaboard, particularly eastern North Carolina, eastern Virginia. That is due to what is going to be a future tropical storm Ophelia. We're not going to talk too much about that. That is your pretty classic tropical cyclone tornado event out there. We're not going to spend any time on that threat, but definitely keep an eye out on warnings there through today and into tomorrow. Now, day two outlook for Saturday. We have a large area of slight risk up from eastern South Dakota, southwest Minnesota, all the way down to the south into central Oklahoma, including the Oklahoma City metro area. We do have an all hazards risk for tomorrow, 2% tornado risk within that slight risk zone, but a 15% damaging wind and large hail threat for tomorrow. I would not be surprised at all to see them bump some of these areas up to enhanced risk later on. They probably need a little bit more data to come in. We'll see what they do at the midday outlook here in a couple of hours. But we'll be back hopefully tomorrow morning with a new update as we get some more data in for tomorrow's threat. And then we go into Sunday. They have introduced a slight risk down for the southern plains, far southern Oklahoma into northern and central Texas. This is mainly going to be a large hail and damaging wind threat. We'll talk about this again at the end of the video, but there is a severe threat that has become evident for North Texas mostly, including the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex for Sunday. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. All right, here is our water vapor satellite imagery, and you can see a few different features pretty quickly. This swirl down here is future tropical cyclone Ophelia, currently potential tropical cyclone 16, expected to make landfall on the North Carolina coast tomorrow morning. We also see this swirl up here in the northwest quadrant of the country. That is our trough that is going to be of interest for the next few days' severe threat. It is riding up and over this ridge. You see this flow that is going like that. That is the top of this ridge centered across Mexico into West Texas. And this trough is riding over that ridge. As we talked about in our previous forecast discussion, if this ridge wasn't there, this trough would be really nicely able to dig down deeply into the southern portion of the country and perhaps bring a more robust severe threat to areas in the southern plains. But because this ridge is pretty stubborn here, this trough is riding up and over that ridge and going to take more of a northward track into the northern plains and eventually the Great Lakes region going into the weekend. But this is our main player for severe weather today and tomorrow. There's a little bit of a short wave. It's hard to tell here. There is a little bit of an enhanced swirl within the larger swirl there across northern Utah. That may be a little bit of a short wave trough that is expected to eject a little bit farther to the north today and help initiate storms here in northeast Wyoming eventually this afternoon. We take a look at our upper air maps here. This is our 500 millibar map. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit so we can get this full picture in there. But this is our trough. You see the center of that trough over southwest Idaho, belt of enhanced flow rounding the base of that trough. We saw on our data from the other day, all that flow was relegated to the backside of this trough. So it was in its maturing phase. Well, now all this flow is now rounding the base of this trough, meaning that it is undergoing maturation, and it is a strong, potent, closed cyclone here moving into the northern portion of the country. Tough to see. There's a little bit of a kink maybe in the flow here across Utah into northwest Colorado. That may be that little shortwave we just talked about. A little bit more evident at 700 millibars, I think. You see a little bit more of a kink here. A couple different kinks in the flow. One here across Utah, one here across Colorado, and then this one here is a pretty well-defined one here. That is not going to be of interest today. That is going to move off a little bit more to the north and we'll have these little kinks in the flow rotating through the main trough and impacting this region here later on to help initiate storm development later on this afternoon. Now, because we have not had this trough fully traverse the Rockies yet, this strong flow still relegated back behind to the west of the Rocky Mountains for the most part. We have not seen a robust surface response yet. You don't see much going on in the surface map here. You see the tropical cyclone out here in the Atlantic, very tightly wound circulation out there. Not much here in the plains though, however, but that is going to change as we go into the next couple of days. Now, a lot of the models were differing based on the surface progression, the progression of the surface pattern over the coming days when we did our previous forecast discussion on this sequence. The models have tightened in a little bit, and we'll go through that in just a second, but we're expecting to see a little bit more cyclogenesis processes undergone today and into tomorrow. Especially that surface low will eject off to the east and northeast a little bit, and we will see a little bit better surface low development going into tomorrow. But nothing at the moment, but we do have nice upslope flow in this region already in place, and that should continue into the afternoon. Here is our surface data. You see those winds are out of the east now from western Nebraska into eastern Wyoming. That is some nice upslope flow, and all of this wind is going to turn a little bit more out of the east or east-southeast today to really provide that upslope flow, that flow going up the higher terrain here of eastern and northeastern Wyoming, and that will also help out in the initiation of storms later on this afternoon. Moisture looking pretty good for this region. We have 50s dew points pervasive across eastern Wyoming at this point, 60s dew points not too far away here across southern Nebraska, northwest Kansas. Those will continue to advect northeastward, and we could see some nice moistening here today. As we talked about before, the higher terrain, the air at higher terrain or higher elevations does not hold as much moisture. So a dew point of 52 here in eastern Wyoming is probably like a 60-degree dew point down in the lower elevations of the plains. So that is plenty of moisture for this region to get severe weather going, and we will probably see an increase in this moisture going into the afternoon as we continue to get that upslope flow to become situated here and get that moisture to continue to flow into this region. Let's go to our, we're not going to look at any soundings today. There's not really much to look at. We don't have soundings up here in Wyoming. So we're going to skip the soundings just in the interest of time here. I want to get to Saturday's threat, as that is the most robust threat, it looks like, for the upcoming sequence. So here is the 12Z NAM, hot off the press this morning. So here is how it's initialized that trough, looking pretty good. Belt of enhanced flow rounding the base of that trough. Closed cyclone here across the northwest. That will continue to move off to the east today. We will see that flow, that stronger flow, really start to impinge into this region going into the afternoon hours. We see a little bit of strengthening of the flow here across this region, so deep layer shear should strengthen as well going into the afternoon, and that will be favorable for supercell development. See a few kinks in here. It's very tough to tell. This main shortwave is situated to the north of the main warm sector, so that's not going to be too much of an issue here. It's going to be these little kinks rotating through the flow that are going to be of interest in initiating storms later on today. Let's go to the surface pattern here, and I'm going to zoom in on the central plains. So you see what happens as we go through the day. We start to see a broad cyclone really start to tighten here out across Colorado into New Mexico. Not really a tight surface cyclone by any means, but certainly some surface cyclogenesis happening as that trough traverses the Rockies. That will really start to put that upslope flow in place. You see all these winds here are pretty much easterly or east-southeasterly. That is some very strong upslope flow. The interesting part here, we talked about this in the video on Wednesday, but this is going to be your warm front here. You see the temperature difference across this, 70s and 80s across Colorado into Kansas, with low to mid 60s up here across Nebraska into South Dakota and even eastern Wyoming. So that is the interesting part here, that we are going to see a very pinched warm sector here. The NAM has it a little bit farther south, perhaps. I suspect it might be a little bit farther to the north. We can probably better see it with moisture. And so this is interesting. The NAM maintains only about upper 40s to 50s dew points here across Wyoming into eastern or western Nebraska, western South Dakota. So that is interesting for sure. I want to take a look maybe at some other models. Let's see what the HRRR is showing. Yeah, so that is interesting. We're not expecting to see dew points rise all that much. Maybe some result of mixing here. And that is quite interesting. That makes me tend to believe that storms may remain a little bit elevated unless they can form in the little bit of higher temperatures here across what looks to be southeast Wyoming. Up here in the slight risk area, temperatures remain in the 60s here. We know the NAM has a cool bias, so they may be a little bit warmer than this. But still, that is quite concerning for surface-based convection. Even though we do have adequate moisture for these temperatures, if we do get to maybe 65 degrees, the temperature dew point spreads, if these dew points hang out around 50, that's still well within the threshold for tornadic supercells. The problem is those temperatures are very, very cool. So we may see a little bit of a stable layer at the surface. And let's take a sounding up here in far eastern Wyoming just to see what's going on here. I suspect there may be a little bit of a stable layer at the surface. Yeah, and that's the problem here. We see a little bit of capping remaining. And we talked about this in our Akron, Colorado case study from back on June 21st. We were under this layer of very thick low-level clouds in southeast Wyoming that day, whereas other areas were warmed nicely with the sunshine. We were not able to get any sunshine, so our temperatures in southeast Wyoming in the 5% stayed in the probably low 60s. It was very, very cool, and that allowed storms to remain a little bit more elevated for quite a while. We still got a brief tornado or two out of it, but those storms remain mostly elevated, and that may be the case today. If we see these types of surface profile, 63 over 52, that is very, very cool. Still would suspect that low-level vorticity and some of that terrain influence may allow us to get a brief tornado or two, but that does not seem like a profile that would foster surface-based supercell development. Still should get some supercells here off the higher terrain that move east into this area, but that is concerning that some of the models are showing. Let's look at what the RAP shows here. Yeah, the RAP showing very, very cool temperatures. All the models locking in on a very cool surface profile here across the slight risk area. So you're going to need supercells to fire down here in southeast Wyoming and far western Nebraska for any chance at surface-based development. Otherwise, these storms are going to remain a little bit elevated, probably a chance of a tornado or two, but still storms will be likely elevated north of this warm frontal boundary, this temperature gradient here that you see on the models, 70s and 80s down here, 60s, 50s and 60s up here, not super favorable for anything surface-based up here to the north. So that is an interesting development for today. Again, they do have a 5% out, probably due to mostly terrain influences, but that is a little bit questionable to me whether or not we will realize that tornado potential. Still could see some supercells. Even if they're elevated, they will have a chance to produce large hail. There is some instability in place, and the terrain influences definitely would provide a large hail threat. But damaging winds also, because the storms may be a little bit more elevated, going to remain at bay because those strong surface gusts can't really penetrate that stable layer and get to the surface as easily as if they were surface-based storms. So that's what is going on for today. Now I want to back out and talk about tomorrow. Tomorrow is the interesting day here, and we really have a complex setup to discuss. So let's go ahead and dive into Saturday's threat. Well, I'm just, again, going to use the NAM. Most of the models are locked in on the same solution with some slight differences in positioning, but the overall progression of the pattern is the same, is pretty much the same among the models now. So we're just going to look at the NAM in the interest of simplicity and time here. So this is 7 p.m. tomorrow, or 7 p.m. this evening, excuse me, and we'll go into tomorrow morning. So here's our trough this evening. Still a big closed circulation with that strong belt of flow rounding the base of that trough. Large ridge of high pressure here down to the south, and in between we're going to see a little bit of an enhanced region of flow. Your pressure gradient tightens here, so you'll see a little bit stronger flow right over top of that ridge, and that is what is going to be the impetus for the threat in the southern plains. We'll talk about that more in just a second. And we're really looking to have what appears to be a bimodal type setup. Ahead of this trough as it moves to the east and ahead of this little wave that is moving atop of the ridge, that is going to create a little bit, perhaps two focal points for the more intense severe weather tomorrow within the broader slight risk. Just as a refresher, tomorrow, just a large slight risk at this point, but it does appear that we could see some more intense storms up here and perhaps down here in the northern and southern portions of that risk area. And that is because we have two different forcing mechanisms here. So as we go into tomorrow morning, that trough really takes on a negative tilt, really becomes very compact as it moves into the northern plains. This is at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time on Saturday, tomorrow. You see the center of that circulation here across central South Dakota. Very strong defluence aloft here in the exit region of that trough. We'll look at 250 millibars. You see very strong spreading apart of those wind vectors in the upper levels, creating a lot of large-scale forcing for ascent, and therefore could see a widespread coverage of storms here in this region. But very compact cyclone here at 500 millibars, exit region right here across eastern South Dakota, southwest Minnesota, western Iowa. Now down here to the south, you see this belt of enhanced flow over top of this ridge, which is centered across central Mexico. As we move to 0Z, 3Z, you see a little bit of a kink in the flow between that trough to the north and the ridge here to the south. That is going to be our very subtle forcing mechanism here for storms across Kansas and Oklahoma. Might arrive a little bit on the later side. This is at 3Z. This is 0Z, actually. The trough axis looks to be maybe somewhere back in here across the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles into southwest Kansas. So we may see a little bit of a late arrival of the forcing down here, but the overall forcing for ascent will eventually arrive and allow for storm development here along the cold front to the south across Kansas into Oklahoma. Now, models have shifted things a little bit farther back to the west since we first looked on Wednesday. So we'll start at on Saturday morning. This is 7 a.m. Central Daylight Time Saturday morning. I'm going to keep the broad view for now, and then we'll zoom in as needed on both of the different modes of severe weather in this setup. So you see, going into Saturday morning, we start to see that surface low consolidate and move off to the east and really just elongate. We have a very elongated surface trough, if you will, with maybe two separate areas here. One center up here across that confluence of Nebraska, South Dakota, Iowa, and one surface low down here, probably in the northwest Texas vicinity into western Oklahoma, creating somewhat of a triple point here across the Kansas-Oklahoma border region. So two different areas of potential focus, and of course there will likely be storms in between the two areas, but these may be the focal points for our more intense convection, why we may see an upgrade for both of these areas in more of a bimodal setup. So let's look at the northern mode first. I'm going to zoom into the Central Plains sector. So this is at 12Z. You see the surface low here moving off to the east, very stretched out surface low along the cold front. This is likely a cold frontal boundary here. You see the wind shift, winds out of the west across the Central Plains, in the Midwest more out of the south or south-southeast. So definitely a frontal boundary somewhere in this vicinity here, stretching down into the southern plains, with a dry line likely setting up somewhere here in Oklahoma, creating that little triple point somewhere in the Kansas-Oklahoma border region. So let's look. So that surface low and cold front moves off to the east, especially in the northern portions of the risk area. That with the very progressive nature of the upper level trough and surface pattern, the cold front here will likely push off to the east. Will be quite progressive. So we may see a lot of frontal forcing, a lot of forcing from the trough aloft. So we may see a very widespread area of storm coverage, and thus a less chance for discrete development up here to the north. So let's look at dew points up here in the northern sector, then we'll zoom back into the south. You see those 60s dew points reaching all the way up into the northern plains, into the Great Lakes states, Minnesota, Iowa, South Dakota. There is your frontal boundary there that will extend off to the southwest. Dry line probably right in there, and the NAM again is way, way west of where it was the other day. The NAM had it back in here on Wednesday. It has since slowed down quite a bit with the slower arrival of the trough. The surface features have responded accordingly, and so we have a much farther west solution here with these models. The GFS showing a similar solution a little bit farther to the east, but still a little bit farther back to the west than what it was back when we did our discussion on Wednesday. So back to the NAM here. Let's get back to the 12Z NAM. So again, this is at 21Z, so 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. You see that cold front extending from South Dakota down into the central and southern plains. Lots of moisture out ahead of that. Again, a lot of forcing though. You'll see the northern portion of the front really starts to move off to the east pretty quickly, whereas the southern portion, because it's farther removed from that trough aloft and is just being influenced by this little subtle forcing mechanism to the south, you're not changing a whole lot in the location of the surface pattern here. So that may be more favorable for discrete convection down to the south. Let's take a sounding up to the north. We'll take a sounding here at the confluence. Go at 21Z, right at the confluence of South Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa, just to see what our threat might look like up here. So Our profiles here, very interesting, very saturated low-level profiles here, 68 over 68. That may be a little bit underdone as far as surface temperatures. We know what the NAM tends to do. It tends to underdo surface temperatures. We do have a decent amount of instability, although in the low levels not so much. That could be, again, due to the too cool surface temperatures here. We'll just have to wait and see. I do assume we will get enough instability for a severe threat up here, although, again, the forcing may make it more of a clustered or linear mode versus discrete storms. A little bit of a wonky wind profile here, a little bit of a weakness at 850 millibars, which is interesting to note. Our low-level jet maybe a little bit farther displaced off to the east, so that is interesting to note that we do have a little bit of a weakness there. Not sure if it's going to be have too much of an impact here. Let's take a sounding just a little bit farther out to the east in that plume of low-level jet, just to see if our photographs are a little bit less wonky in the low levels. And you see that they are a little bit decent instability there, with a very favorable looking photograph for tornadic supercells up there. But again, storm mode is going to be the question. That progressive cold front and fast moving trough may mean, and a lot of forcing may mean that we see a clustered or linear mode pretty quickly in that northern sector. But those photographs definitely favorable for tornadoes, 350 plus meters squared per second squared of effective storm relative helicity. Bulk shear at 66 knots, so very strong deep layer shear for supercells. So we could see a pretty pervasive MCS develop out of this activity with some embedded supercells with all hazards possible. So that is the northern mode. So places like eastern South Dakota, western Nebraska, western Iowa, eastern Nebraska, western Iowa, southwest Minnesota tomorrow afternoon. Let's go down to the southern plains now and take a look at our features in the southern mode here. So cold front extending back in here. That, again, is not going to move a whole lot in the day because we don't have a lot of forcing and the progressive nature of the trough to push that cold front along. So here's what we have going on. This is at Saturday at 4 p.m. This is at 7 p.m. So here we are, and you can see where our cold front is. Cold front extending, I'll draw that in blue. Cold front extending back to the southwest, and our dry line likely setting up somewhere in here as well. So our dry line probably setting up somewhere in here, creating a little bit of a triple point here. You see a little bit of that moisture tongue feeding back in, kind of curling back in there. That is what appears to be a little bit of a triple point there ahead of the surface low. And this is a pattern that we have seen quite a few times before, where we have this northern mode and when we also have a southern mode with a secondary sort of surface low or triple point. I want to bring your attention to this paper by John Davies, a great meteorologist out of Kansas City, on the Joplin tornado from 2011. And he went through a bunch of different setups in the past that were similar to the Joplin setup and found that this setup that we saw on Joplin and that we're kind of seeing for Saturday's event is quite common. I'll refer you to figure 13 from this Davies paper, and I'll put a link to the Davies paper in the description below. But this is a pretty common setup that we've seen before. You have your primary surface low up to the north across the northern plains or the Great Lakes, your cold front draping down to the south and southwest, eventually meeting up with a secondary surface low or triple point where the cold front and the dry line meet somewhere in the southern plains, southern Kansas, northern Oklahoma. And ahead of that, you tend to see tornadic activity out ahead of that secondary surface low, especially when that secondary triple point or surface low and the surface features are not moving a whole lot as they are on Saturday. So this is a common setup and one that we often see significant severe weather, including significant tornadoes, and that's what we're going to see tomorrow. Now, I want to preface this by saying that I am not at all saying that anything in the realm of the Joplin tornado is going to happen tomorrow on Saturday. I'm just saying that this is a setup that we've seen before that has been associated with significant severe weather, so we definitely need to keep that in mind. And the southern portion of the risk I'm watching very, very closely because of some of the historical analogs to this setup. So you see that, and I'm going to zoom out here. We can draw in our features. I'll zoom out to the contiguous U.S. So we have our surface low, northern surface low centered up here in eastern South Dakota, southwest Minnesota, cold front draped down to the south. And then we have a dry line developing somewhere in this vicinity here, creating a secondary surface low or triple point. You see that little kink in the pressure contours here. That is a little triple point or kink, little secondary surface low there right along the cold front there in northern Oklahoma, Kansas-Oklahoma border region there. So definitely conceptually something that we've seen before, is something, a background pattern that has been associated with significant severe weather. So just again, not saying that Joplin is going to happen at all, anything in that realm, just saying that we have seen this setup before and it has been associated with significant severe weather. So I just wanted to make that clear before we go on. So back to the surface here. This is at 21Z, 4 p.m., 0Z, and you see, unlike the northern mode, that initiating boundary here does not move a lot at all going into the evening hours. That's because we have a very subtle forcing mechanism aloft, so it's not really going to push this frontal boundary to the east a lot. We will eventually see that cold front start sagging down to the south going into the evening hours, but we should have a window here going into the early evening hours where we could see development along that cold front and triple point there in northwest Oklahoma, southern Kansas. Now, just to show you where the GFS is, GFS again is much farther west than it was. This does bring the Oklahoma City metro area in play, and the I-35 corridor in play, places like Wichita as well, whereas the other day that was not really the case. Those areas were too far west. Now, a lot of the models are locked into a more western solution. The NAM is definitely on the western side of the guidance for sure, but definitely does bring the Oklahoma City Metro and Wichita Metros in play for Saturday. So let's go ahead and take some soundings. Again, I'm going to zoom in. Let's show you where the surface or the upper level trough is here. A little bit of a kink, a little stronger belt of flow impinging into this region. And you see the difference here. Much less forcing here with this very subtle little shortwave rounding the ridge, rounding the top of the ridge. And our surface, our initiating boundary here, looking like that. And given that our flow aloft is very subtle and very much westerly, we should see very much perpendicular shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary, and that's exactly what we get there. So definitely more of a chance for discrete supercells here in the southern mode, especially right ahead of that triple point there. You see that little tongue there. That is going to be our favorite area. So according to this, it'll be right on that Kansas-Oklahoma border region, northern to northwest Oklahoma into southern Kansas, depending on where these features end up. See plenty of moisture as well, 60s and even 70s dew points out here to the east. So moisture not an issue with this southern mode as well. Let's take a couple of soundings here. We'll take one at 0Z. I'm going to take one here in northern Oklahoma, probably just to the north of the Enid area. And this is definitely a favorable profile for severe weather. Now, the one thing you notice here, temperature dew point spreads are definitely on the high side to start. 92 over 65. That is well above that 20-degree threshold we like to use for tornadic activity. So that we also see at least weaker low-level shear to start as well. This is again at 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time on Saturday. And so that coupled with some decent instability, high temperature dew point spreads may mean that storms initially will be somewhat high-based and foster more of a hail threat. Mixed layer CAPE above 2,000 joules per kilogram, weaker low-level shear. So the hail threat will likely be the main risk, at least initially with these storms. Now as we go into the evening hours, let's go to 3Z. And I'm going to take a sounding here. We'll take one here in a little bit better moisture as those storms move off of that initiating boundary into this better moisture possibly. Let's see what the soundings look like here. So this is again at 3Z, 10 p.m. Central Daylight Time. And this again you see as a much better profile for tornadic activity. You see instability still hovering around that 2,000 joules per kilogram mark. The temperature dew point spreads have come down a little bit, 83 over 69 there. Decent instability with very strong low-level shear. As the low-level jet ramps up, we should see that low-level jet really start to ramp up into the evening hours. We'll look at the 850 millibar map, and you see as we go from the afternoon into the evening, low-level jet really starts to ramp up out here ahead of that triple point. So any storms that move into this environment definitely will see increasing low-level shear with the possibility for more tornadic activity here as well. You see very favorable looking hodographs, deep layer shear about 40 knots. That is well within the range for supercells. Low-level shear very strong as well. Large clockwise curved hodographs, strong veering of those low-level winds with height, over 400 meters squared per second squared of effective storm relative helicity for right-moving supercells to take advantage of. And again, storms should remain somewhat discrete here for a few hours before eventually congealing into more of a clustered mode. But I do see a definite all hazards threat here with any supercells that can form along that triple point. And again, they may be a little bit later to initiate, but still, it doesn't matter a whole lot. We could see a significant severe threat develop with these storms as well. So let's take a look at some high-res models. And again, you need to take these with a grain of salt. But we'll look for today. Keep your eyes peeled up here. This is the latest HRRR run. And this is what it is showing for today. As we go on in the afternoon, you see it does develop some supercells there, but again, that is farther north of that the surface area where they would be surface based there. So these storms should remain elevated, would produce a large hail threat. Tornado threat is definitely going to be limited with any storms that are in that colder surface air because they will be a little bit elevated. And then we go into the evening hours, and we start to see additional development up to the north. And I'm going to go back to the 12Z HRRR as that goes out a little bit farther. And again, for tomorrow, this is looking at tomorrow, but we're going to take this with a grain of salt because these convective allowing models are not all that good this far out. So 12Z HRRR, you see as we go into the afternoon hours, or in the overnight hours tomorrow, we see additional development here across this area. So again, lots of forcing that is going to allow lots of storms to fire, given the progressive nature of the front and the upper level features. And so lots of forcing, that is going to mean a lot of storms out here as well. And you see pretty much a good amount of convection early on with additional development later on. And you can see it's just an instant mess, maybe a couple supercells in here, but it is going to be tough to get discrete storms in this mode because of how progressive the features are with this setup. You can see pretty instantly into a linear or clustered mode there up into the northern plains and Midwest states. Down to the south for tomorrow. Let's see what happens. Southern Plains sector. So we have some activity today across eastern Oklahoma. Nothing of interest really. And then around 22, 23Z, the HRRR does fire some storms, and you can see much more discrete or semi-discrete mode here along that boundary. And I do suspect that the HRRR probably is firing these storms a little bit farther east than the NAM would because of the surface features being a little bit farther west with what the NAM is showing. And you can see that that triple point is definitely farther to the east than what the NAM was showing, which is back in here somewhere. So that is why the storms are a little bit displaced from what we were talking about with as when we showed the NAM run. But still, the idea is going to be the same with the progression of these storms. So once again, we go into tomorrow evening, and by late afternoon, very late afternoon at the earliest, into the evening hours, we get semi-discrete supercell development there in southeast Kansas and northern Oklahoma, and those will continue into the evening hours, perhaps stretching back here to the southwest into central Oklahoma, and then eventually they will congeal into more of a clustered linear mode there, going into eastern Oklahoma and Arkansas eventually. So that is what the HRRR is showing. Let's see what some of the other models are showing. I'm going to start here with the Southern Plains sector for tomorrow, and then we'll go up to the north. So you see very much a similar progression here. Storms fire around 5 to 6 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Some semi-discrete storms in there initially, and then eventually they will congeal into a line as that low-level jet ramps up. A couple of more discrete supercells here on the tail end of the line, but that is definitely interesting to note. NSSL WRF for the southern sector, and then we'll again go back to the northern sector, and we'll see pretty much the exact same thing. Some semi-discrete supercells at first, eventually congealing into a clustered mode as they move into eastern Oklahoma and Arkansas. So the cams do appear to be locked onto a solution for the southern mode for tomorrow. Definitely storms seeming to fire in southern Kansas, northern Oklahoma by very late afternoon, 22, 23Z, which is about 5 or 6 p.m. And then eventually they will move into eastern Oklahoma and perhaps as far south as central Oklahoma going into tomorrow evening. Let's go to the north now, our northern sector for tomorrow. So we'll start here with the NSSL WRF, and you can see that for today, not a whole lot going on. Now the NSSL WRF does have a supercell down here a little bit farther south in the higher temperatures along that warm front. So that would have the greatest, if that solution were to come to fruition, that would have the greatest threat for tornadoes for today's event. So we'll have to watch that for sure. But as we go into tomorrow for Saturday, you just see a lot of stuff develop here. Couple of supercells in here, at least initially. Then again, this is firing a lot earlier than the southern sector because of the quick ejection of the trough. Couple of supercells in here, but a pretty quick transition to a more messy linear mode as it moves off to the east. WRF ARW model. And again, we're using an ensemble approach with these cams because we don't want to just look at one. And you see not much here going on in this northern mode, the area for today. A couple of supercells there going into the evening, but not a whole lot to speak of. And then going into tomorrow, much of the same. An arc of storms quickly developing into a line ahead of the surface low and upper trough up there. So pretty complex setup for Saturday. But that is pretty much the gist of Saturday. Definitely, to me, looks like the most robust severe threat between the next 3 days, including today. So we'll definitely have to keep that in mind. Now let's go ahead and zoom back out and just want to talk briefly about Sunday in the southern plains. Again, we have a slight risk for Sunday, day 3, September 24th, down across central and northern Texas into far southeast Oklahoma, with large marginal risks surrounding that. So just not going to spend too much time on this, but again, we have that belt of flow that is going to remain from the Saturday event and kind of just become situated across this area. We will have leftover moisture as well. Again, that cold front is not going to sweep through this area as much because it is much farther removed from the main forcing mechanism to the north. So you see, as we zoom into our southern plains sector here, the cold front, again, the surface feature is not going to move a whole lot. We still will have plenty of moisture remaining going into Sunday for the severe threat there. And you see, 60s into 70s dew points here across this region. So plenty of moisture, and we should have, again, that surface low type feature developing. Temperature is going to be very warm into the 90s here with dew points in the mid 60s. So that is going to allow for these storm bases to be quite high. Temperature dew point spread is going to be on the higher side here with this event. So that is going to negate the tornado threat for Sunday. But that doesn't mean that we won't have other types of severe weather here. We should get surface-based supercell development along that dry line / frontal boundary. And you see a lot of instability there. Temperatures getting warm, that little bit of forcing aloft to help cool those mid-level temperatures. 3,000 plus joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE. Deep layer shear certainly favorable for supercells thanks to that belt of enhanced flow aloft. 41 knots of effective bulk shear. And limited low-level shear. You see not much curvature there in the hodograph, not much veering of those low-level winds with height. So that is going to foster a large hail threat, perhaps significant hail threat here. Very strong instability, weak low-level shear, supercell favorable shear with large temperature dew point spreads. That is a classic setup for large hail and damaging outflow winds. So that looks to be the main threats. Those look to be the main threats for Sunday's event across North Texas into southern Oklahoma. Supercells should certainly fire here across this region ahead of the dry line / frontal boundary by Sunday afternoon. Across North Texas into far southern Oklahoma with a large hail and damaging wind threat. Again, the tornado threat is very, very low given high temperature dew point spreads and weak low-level shear. So that's going to do it for this video. Definitely an active period that we're in starting off this fall season. Today is the last day of summer. As we plunge into fall over the next couple of days, we're certainly starting off this fall season of severe weather with a bang. So once again, to recap the threats, today's threat for Friday, September 22nd, slight risk here in eastern Wyoming, southwest South Dakota, and northwest Nebraska. There is an all hazards threat, although I am certainly skeptical of the tornado threat given such cool surface temperatures here. Definitely doesn't mean we won't see a tornado or two. Definitely don't think there's going to be any long-lived tornadic activity up there, given the very cold temperatures and a tendency for storms to remain elevated. But that doesn't mean we won't see other severe weather with them. Large to significant hail is going to be a threat, elevated or not. So some large hail and damaging winds will be limited given the elevated nature of the storms for the most part. Then we go into tomorrow. Currently, it is at a slight risk. We're going to, eagerly awaiting the update in an hour and a half or so as I'm recording this. So we may eventually see an upgrade in the severe threats for some portion of these areas. Definitely going to be more of a bimodal setup with two focal points, one up here in the northern portion of this slight risk ahead of the main upper trough and surface low. That will be a very quick, looks to be a lot of forcing, so very quick transition to a line. That will mean mostly a damaging wind threat, perhaps a few tornadoes as well, especially later on embedded within the line and any embedded supercells within that line. And then to the southwest, storms may be a little bit more discreet, at least initially, ahead of that secondary triple point. Once again, this is a setup where we've seen significant severe weather with this background pattern, so definitely need to keep that in mind. But definitely an enhanced severe threat down here could become upgraded in future outlooks for more of a initial discrete supercell mode with all hazards possible, and eventually a damaging wind threat as they congeal into more of a clustered or linear mode going into the evening. And so we'll have to keep a close eye on that going into tomorrow. And then for Saturday, we have a slight risk now in North Texas into southern Oklahoma. Tornado threat is very, very low given high temperature dew point spreads and weak low-level shear, but large hail and damaging winds are certainly a possibility with supercells in North Texas on Saturday. That does include the DFW Metroplex. So that's going to do it for this video. I hope to be back tomorrow morning with another update. If they do upgrade the risk for tomorrow, I do hope to be back to do a forecast update video tomorrow morning on the Saturday-Sunday threat. So with that, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.